Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the fifth meeting of the Justice Subcommittee on Policing in 2017. No apologies have been received. Our first agenda item today is an evidence session on Audit Scotland's 2015-16 audit report of the Scottish Police Authority. Can I welcome Caroline Gardner, Auditor General for Scotland, Gillian Woolman, Assistant Director, Catherine Young, Audit Manager, and Mark Roberts, Senior Manager from Audit Scotland. Can I refer members to paper 1, which is the note by the clerk, and paper 2, which is a private paper, and can I now invite the Auditor General to make a brief opening statement?
Thank you, Convener, and thank you for the opportunity to brief the subcommittee on my report on the 2015-16 audit of the Scottish Police Authority. I produce these Section 22 reports when I want to highlight to Parliament something that's come out of the annual audit process that happens each year with every public body. As the subcommittee will be aware, I've reported on the audit of the Scottish Police Authority during all 3 years of its existence, and I will do so again before the end of this calendar year following the audit of the 2016-17 accounts. I'm conscious that we haven't got a lot of time today, so I'd just like to briefly highlight 2 key issues. First, I've repeatedly emphasised weak financial leadership within both the SPA and Police Scotland. This has been a continuing problem since the establishment of the 2 organisations, and it would be unacceptable in any public body, let alone in those of the size and significance of the SPA and Police Scotland. The appointment of a Chief Operating Officer to Police Scotland during 2016-17 and the current recruitment of a Chief Financial Officer have the potential to improve financial leadership and management across both organisations, and this must be a priority in my view. Secondly, we've estimated that the SPA and Police Scotland could face a cumulative funding gap of £188 million by the end of this parliamentary session. Since I published my report in December 2016, Policing 2026 has been published for consultation. The strategy recognises the scale of the future financial challenge and the need for investment to allow transformational change that will help to fill the funding gap. One element of that change will be the greater use of technology to transform how police officers and staff do their jobs and to release efficiency savings. With regard to technology, as you'll know, I've recently published a report on the police's failed I6 programme, and I look forward to discussing that with the subcommittee later in the month, or if time allows today. You've named the colleagues who accompany me. Between us, we'll do our very best to answer the subcommittee's questions.
Okay, thank you very much. I appreciate that. Perhaps I could start the questions then by asking you a more, I suppose, pointed question around the financial expertise. As you've said, you have continually highlighted the weak financial leadership that's been shown in the SPA and Police Scotland, and a shortage of capacity and competency. And on Tuesday at the Public Audit Committee, the Chair of the SPA acknowledged that achieving the necessary levels of financial expertise within policing is taking longer than expected, and went on to say that with recent appointments he anticipated far more rapid progress. And I'd like you to comment on whether you think that is the case. But before you do that, I wonder if you could also additionally comment on the comment that was made by John Foley, the Chief Executive of SPA, when he said that they have strengthened the financial team in Police Scotland with the addition of more professionally qualified accountants. They have a complement of around 20, which they are increasing, and they are also improving the experience and skills mix. And I'd be interested specifically on your views on whether or not 20 accountants is sufficient, too much, and if you have any idea of the additional cost that this will incur. They are also in the process of recruiting a permanent Chief Financial Officer, and they hope that that person will be in situ for April. April is only 2 weeks away. Do you have any indication on whether or not that appointment has been made and that person is ready to take up office? And I appreciate there's a number of questions in there that I've asked you.
I'll make a start, Convener. I'll ask Gillian Woolman to pick up the more detailed question in a moment, if I may. My understanding is that the Chief Financial Officer has not yet been appointed, although the recruitment process is underway. And I think it's worth me being clear that the concerns that I've stressed in my report since November 2013 have been about financial leadership at the most senior levels of the authority and of Police Scotland. Clearly, there is a need to have enough qualified and competent staff to carry out the work, but the leadership is the issue that I think has been of real concern given the scale of transformation. Gillian, could you give a quick update on the way in which that capacity is built up?
Thank you. Happy to respond to that particular aspect. I've been involved as the appointed auditor for the last 3 years, and during that time there has been obviously the merger of the 8 former joint boards, but there's also been consideration of the structure of the finance function, and there was some protracted discussion at the beginning with the establishment of the 2 new national bodies where responsibilities would lie. So it took some time for that to settle down. There was then the process of establishing the structure within it, as well as assigning where the function would sit. That has taken a period of time. There has been recruitment activities over those 3 years, and also a matching process for those individuals that were coming from joint boards into a centralised finance function. But there's no doubt I am aware that there has been vacancies during that period of time, and when I was carrying out the planning process for the 2015-16 audit, Police Scotland certainly drew to my attention that there were a number of vacancies, in particular at more junior levels within the Police Scotland finance function at that time. In the course of the 2015-16 audit, it became more apparent that there was a lack of strength in particular finance competencies, and we're thinking here of capital accounting and so on. So they've clearly been on a journey. They've not fulfilled the journey as they might have wished to have done at the time they embarked upon it, to see a good finance function established for the national body. I'm also happy to pick up.
Before I bring in perhaps other panel members, can I just ask you then, do you get a sense that there has been a recognition that there were a range of problems, there's been an acknowledgement of how they needed to tackle the problems, and do you get any sense that they are now in a far better place to take forward financial leadership and direction?
They have certainly acknowledged that there are weaknesses, and I think we would identify from our previous reporting that they have previously acknowledged those weaknesses, but the actions that they have taken up until now were not strong enough. And once again, the Chief Executive for the Scottish Police Authority has said, recognises that more needs to be done because the need has not yet been met.
I don't know if either of the other 2 panel members want to comment. I've got Stuart Stevenson waiting to come in with a supplementary. Stuart.
To add to what Gillian said. So
thank you, Convener. You've just made reference to weaknesses in capital accounting. I take it that there will be an asset register that will be a part of how they manage their capital accounting. I recognise it will be a difficult one, integrating 8 schemes of capital assets. How satisfied are you with the up-to-dateness and correctness of the register itself and how that's managed, and what challenges remain there?
So when we carried out, in particular, the audit for the year 2014-15, there were a number of significant problems with the asset register for that year, and a new system was brought in that was called Asset 4000. And I must say members of the external audit team that I lead are very familiar with Asset 4000 that is used in other public sector bodies. During the year 2015-16, the most recent audit that's been concluded, the operation of Asset 4000 was going considerably better. Much improvement had been made there. However, we did have problems to do with the valuations of assets, and in fact it was the categorisation of certain assets that led to errors in their valuations, and that manifested itself as a problem and in our reporting for the 2015-16 audit.
So have they a consistent categorisation and depreciation policy that applies to different categories, or is that still something where there's a hangover from the variability there's likely to have been from 8 previous forces?
Yes, when we consider the accounting policies each year, we are looking precisely at those areas. We have suggested they tended to amalgamate their previous accounting policies and then keep them rather wide. There's definitely a need to tighten down on those accounting policies, depreciation, asset lives, etc.
Yes, good afternoon. I wonder if I could direct my first question to Gillian Woolman. I note that you say when the amalgamation took place, a number of individuals, experienced individuals, had left during that period of transition. when we were creating a national force. Could you give a little bit more detail about who they were, what they did and how that impacted?
I'm afraid I don't have the precise numbers to hand, but I'm very conscious from the first year of the full audit, 2013-14, there were significant cuts to staff numbers, and a number of those affected corporate services and the finance function in particular. So you can imagine the voluntary early retirement scheme was key also to maintaining costs at a certain level. We did raise questions about business cases for all of the departures at various times, but there was certainly a loss of experience at that time with the establishment of the new national force and a new function being established.
I would really be hoping to drill down a little bit further. Things had operated pretty well under the 8 legacy forces. We're now moving to a single police force. Key financial, I take it, expertise was lost. It would be good, I think, to learn from the past, to see how it worked well and what now wasn't working in one police force, to look at what these people did, at what point they did it, how they talked to each other, if they did indeed talk to each other. Is that information that can be got or that you think is relevant or to look at in terms of moving forward to make sure that we're getting things right?
I think what I'd focus on, Ms Mitchell, is the matters that I reported on in my November 2013 report, which was about, first of all, the disagreement about where responsibility for financial leadership should sit between the SPA and Police Scotland. And then once that disagreement had been resolved sometime later, about the time it took to establish a permanent financial leadership and finance function across the two organisations. As we said in response to the convener's first question, the appointment of a chief financial officer is still continuing almost 4 years after the establishment. And I think it's that lack of clarity about where the responsibility lay and the associated failure to put in place a structure and to recruit the right people to it that has allowed this drift to happen. We've got great sympathy with the staff who were in post during the period. The challenge, I think, has been that lack of clarity about who is accountable for it at the top of the organisation.
I suppose my difficulty is then we may be looking at the appointment of a chief financial officer being a panacea, when actually if we looked at the arrangements before, it might have been the arrangements more at ground level, which was making the financial accountability work better, because if we don't kind of know how it worked before and what impact and what these people did when that experience was lost, then are we really even getting it right now, would be the question.
I think we do know that previously the expertise was located either in the local authorities that took responsibility for the unitary police forces or the joint boards across most of Scotland. And there was a process that Gillian alluded to for giving people the opportunity to move into the new organisation as it was formed. But without that leadership at the top to say, for a brand new organisation that's spending more than £1 billion of public money a year providing policing right across Scotland, what do we need? It took a very long time for that to happen and for a structure to be put in place.
The convener mentioned it, and this is related to it, the 20 professional accountants. Now, I presume they'll be spread over. What cost are we looking at, and what exactly are these 20 accountants doing? I mean, what is the actual cost of employing them?
So I don't have the actual cost for the employment of the additional 20, but certainly we know at the planning phase there were at least 16 vacancies. So these posts are filling establishment posts. We're not aware that they're changing the size of the finance workforce. It was the vacancy factor that they were carrying. And also they have recognised the competency and the competencies that they now require. There's a very big step change going from 8 smaller bodies to one very large public sector body in Scotland, and gearing up for that. There's also the need to have a lot of rationalisation of finance systems. There still are numerous payroll, accounts payable systems and so on, and it needs a particular skill set to see through the introduction and the implementation of national financial systems. So that's all got to be achieved, and it needs a particular skill set for that.
Sorry to press you, but do we know exactly what they're doing and what it costs? I mean, because money has not been spent well so far. 20 accountants sounds like quite a big bill, might be replacing people that were there before, but it would be good to quantify that, and I think it would be also very good to pin down exactly what these 20 accountants were responsible for individually.
The Chief Executive of the SPSA undertook after the SPA's appearance before the Public Audit Committee a couple of weeks ago to provide more information about what they're doing around the finance function. We'll have a look at that and see if there's anything we can add to it for the subcommittee, if that would be helpful.
That would be very helpful.
You mentioned 10. You mentioned 8, and in the evidence, sometimes Mr. Flanagan refers to the amalgamation of 10 organisations. The Chief Officer, the Chief Constable says 8. You could almost say 10. What are the 2 additional for the avoidance of doubt they're talking about?
So there are 8 police joint boards, and there were 2 other bodies. One was SPSA and one was SCDEA, centralised functions to support police across Scotland. But so 8 with constabulary members and 2 other bodies.
Could I just, and I know John Finney wants to get in a supplementary, but there's just 2 further questions. I think they said at the beginning the focus had been on operational policing and not financial. Now, I would have thought the 2 went hand in hand. It makes sense. You can't have an operational function working well without looking at the finances. So my question is the balance right now? What comfort have we got that is actually right? And perhaps tagged on to that, I notice even at this stage, they're saying we need a corporate response here. We're not there yet. So that seems to me a very big question mark.
I would absolutely agree with you that you can't separate financial sustainability from operational considerations. I think I said in my report in November 2013 that the police had focused their attention very much on maintaining policing on the ground right across Scotland and did that successfully. And at the same time, it's critical that the new leadership of the SPA and Police Scotland understand the finances they've inherited, understand the way that will develop over the next 5 to 10 years, and put in place plans both to bring the finances into balance and to think about how to use the opportunity to transform policing, to make it fit for the 21st century, and to make sure that it can be delivered within the budget that's likely to be available. One of the things that I've reported again in my 2015-16 report is that financial strategy, although some progress has been made, is really still not fully up and running to help them close the funding gap. I've forecast a funding gap of about 188 million by the end of the decade. That's a conservative estimate. And I note that the Policing 2026 strategy that's now been published for consultation again recognises the scale of the financial challenge and sets out a vision for how it will be filled, but we haven't yet seen the underpinning financial plans, IT, estates, vehicles and workforce strategy that will help to make a reality of that, and it really is critical that it's in place.
It was just because, and this is my very last point, Convener, the Chief Constable then went on to say, Mr Flanagan having said too much in operational, we took our eye off the ball with financial, and then the Chief Constable goes on to say, we know that we haven't looked at the resources properly enough, and there's a resource in these areas that we can redirect into operational, and you're thinking, have they really still got the message that finance must go in hand with operational?
I would say progress has been made, but they're not there yet.
Can I just ask you for a bit further clarification on the point you made about the deficit of 188 million? When you say that that's your estimate, that's your conservative estimate, do you have any figure in mind that you think that deficit could potentially rise to?
No, the 188 million figure is included in my report from December 2016. As always, there is judgment and estimation included in that, and that's the figure that I focused on. But I do think it's fair to make the committee aware that I think it's conservative. It's not at the top end of what could happen. It's a reasonable estimate.
Okay, perhaps maybe in the midpoint?
I'd prefer not to be drawn on it, just to give you that caveat.
I've got 3 supplementaries, John, then Stuart and then Rona. John.
It's more a comment, and I don't dissent from Margaret's line of question. I think it's absolutely vital we bore into this. But I'm not necessarily in favour of revisiting where we were before, not least because there may be an opportunity to pick up on a a piece of information that should have informed decision-making for the new body. It's right to say that there was 10, there was the 8 forces, there was the central services, which were the Scottish Police College effectively, and some other technical aspects and the Drug Enforcement Agency. But of course, in the run-up to the advent of Police Scotland, there was a work stream led by an Assistant Chief Constable that should have informed decision-making. So that it might be that that's a point of reference rather than, I don't know how informative that work stream would be, and it certainly doesn't seem to have delivered clarity around the finance function. But it may be that there's a source of information.
I think that's absolutely the case in terms of the run-up to April 2013. The situation that I reported on in November of that year was that the different interpretations of what the legislation said about the roles of the SPA and of Police Scotland meant that much of that work wasn't being acted on, and it took a while for that to be resolved. Once it was, there's been a lot of catching up to do, both in terms of investing in the corporate centre to make sure it can do the job and producing the plans that are needed to make policing sustainable for the rest of the century.
Okay, if I just made that, so there's no debate that the bun fight there was at the advent of Police Scotland is now resolved, and there's no debate where responsibility lies between the authority and Police Scotland.
I think there's now much more clarity than there was. The Scottish Government intervened and reached agreement with the SPA and Police Scotland around who would take responsibility for what. We're now seeing more clarity about the financial leadership arrangements, but those arrangements are still being filled with recruitment of key posts still underway.
Thanks. Thank you.
Stuart.
I've been looking at the audit risks that are documented in your report, and I'm looking at 4, preparation of financial statements. And from the results and conclusions, you state, no evidence initially of effective review by the SPA senior management team and PSOS executive team prior to the draft accounts being submitted for audit. You then go on to say, by the end of the audit, adjustments have been posted to the accounts and subject to audit. So at a mechanical level, I'm taking that the outcome was satisfactory. But I'm left with the question as to whether the processes that all the senior management team undertake on a regular basis in relation to keeping track of what's going on in accounting, I don't get the sense in what you've written here that you're yet satisfied that's happening. And in particular, I ask, you may not be able to answer, whether at the regular meetings there is always a financial statement before the senior management who can therefore conclude whether they're on, ahead or behind of the targets that they of necessity must be managing.
I'll ask Jill as the external auditor to answer your question.
Yeah. It's certainly the case that there is a Finance and Investment Committee underneath the board of the Scottish Police Authority, and they routinely, at every meeting, will be receiving high-level summarised management information to assist them in monitoring the financial position of the organisation throughout the year. Because our focus is very much on the financial accounts at the year end, and we've invested a lot of time in that area, we haven't invested a lot of time at this stage in looking more closely at the in-year management accounts, but we are assured that that process is there, and we certainly have auditors from time to time observing such committees to see the discharge of the responsibilities of that nature.
It may be a question for others rather than you. Have you any sense of how often the Finance Subcommittee meets?
I'm afraid I don't know it exactly. It would be at least 6 times per annum, but I don't know this precisely.
Okay. Are you satisfied that in establishing that subcommittee, this isn't simply a mechanism for those who meet in the main board being able to tick the box and then disregard what's going on in finance?
No, I don't believe that to be the case at all. I think there's been increasing rigour, certainly over the last 18 months, ensuring the effectiveness of that committee's operations to support the board in the discharge of their duties.
Thank you, Camilla.
Rona.
Yes, it's just going back to staffing. You mentioned the Policing 2026 report states its intention to maintain police officer numbers, but it also says that changes in the overall balance and profile of the workforce are expected by 2020. Can you envisage what changes might be necessary, to what they might actually be referring to there?
I think that is a question you'd have to ask the SPA. It's worth noting, though, that my estimate of the 188 million funding gap that I referred to earlier in my exchange with the convener is based on the existing ways of operating, existing numbers of staff and so on. So without something changing, that gap will continue. That something could be providing policing in a different way, in the way that the 2026 strategy suggests. It could be a different funding arrangement with the Scottish Government, but if nothing changes, that gap will be there and will be growing. So there is a need to look again at how best to use the police officers, police staff, the money that's spent on policing now to meet the rising and changing demands that are referred to very thoroughly in the draft strategy.
Can I also just ask you about the backfilling of posts being performed by police staff when office staff were lost? David Page from Police Scotland told the Public Audit Committee that this did not deliver the corporate back office transformation, and it has been more expensive than what it should have been. Basically, it hadn't turned out the way they thought it would. Have you any comment to make on how that could have happened?
Yes, I mean, again, I think it goes back to my report from November 2013 on the way that Police Scotland and the SPA had been formed, that the outline business case that had been put in place before the legislation was passed was at a very high level, didn't contain very much detail. As we moved towards the establishment of the SPA and Police Scotland, that business case was never fully refreshed and updated to reflect the circumstances in 2013. The SPA and Police Scotland knew they had to reduce costs in order to fit within the budget that was available. In fact, that was one of the objectives of reform, not the only one, but one of them. But against a backdrop of not having a financial strategy and a workforce strategy, with the inability to make police officers redundant at all, and a no compulsory redundancy policy for other staff, the risk was always that savings would be made in a piecemeal way rather than in a way that reflected where the SPA and Police Scotland wanted to get to for the longer term. And I think that's what Mr Page was referring to when he gave evidence to the Public Audit Committee a couple of weeks ago.
Okay, thank you.
Liam.
Yeah, maybe a question or two on staffing, but can I take you back firstly to the issue around the deficit? You've said in response to earlier questions that this is a conservative estimate, the figure of 188 million. Could you just clarify what the position is with regard to that deficit in light of the agreement by the Scottish Government to put in additional, albeit reduced, reform funding in the recent budget? And 25 million was the figure.
On the absolute up-to-date position as far as we can.
The estimate of 188 million, and when we published that, predated the announcement of the additional 25 million that went in, so it doesn't reflect that, which is part of the budget for next year. What it does reflect is the government's 17-18 draft budget, as was introduced just before we published in December. It reflected the Scottish Government's commitment to maintain a real terms increase in the police budget for the duration of this Parliament. At the time, there was the continuing commitment to maintain police numbers, so it reflects that, and then is based on Office of Budget Responsibility projections for future rises in the cost of living and costs associated with it. So those are the factors that are included. Within that, there was also what we knew about the existing reform funding, Change Fund. We assumed that would continue on into the future. Because we felt that was a conservative estimate and a prudent way of making the projection. Hence the Auditor General's comments about this being a conservative estimate. And,
I mean, do you have any views? I mean, I suppose in a circumstance where you've got an organisation that's carrying a debt of around 188 million at a conservative estimate, the temptation is to use any additional funding to kind of plug gaps rather than necessarily do the kind of longer term sort of transformational structural change that will ultimately bring that budget down. I mean, what insurances have you got that in a sense this isn't just being used to plug gaps?
We've reported in the report that, and on the basis of Gillian's annual audit report, that reform funding was being used to support recurring revenue expenditure, and it had, certainly in previous years, it had also not been clear what that reform funding had been used for. There is greater clarity now within the accounts in terms of what it's being used for, but that demonstrates that certainly some of that money is going into supporting the revenue budget.
In the sense, it's not, it's perhaps slowing the rate at which that growth and deficit has happened, but isn't actually necessarily giving you complete confidence that it's being used in a way that will turn that deficit around over the...
I think it's not wholly clear to us that that money is being used for what you might term reform activities that might enable kind of the transformation that Vision 2026 foresees, and therefore helping to plug that funding gap. No.
I was going to say the reference in Policing 2026 to the service-wide transformation to quote, bring our budget into balance in a sustainable way by the end of 2019-20. Is that a realistic timeframe? I mean, I know people want to tell us things to cheer us up, but I think given the history, in a sense, we'd rather be told what's a realistic timeframe rather than necessarily what they think they want to hear.
I think it will certainly be challenging. I absolutely agree with the way Mark's described the use of the reform funding. There's another dimension that I think is important. In 2015-16, the SPA's budget was brought broadly into balance by offsetting a revenue overspend against a capital underspend, about 20 million on each side. Now, that 20 million pounds capital is money that could have been used to invest in new estate, new vehicles, new IT equipment, again, that would all help to modernise and develop the way in which policing is being delivered. That wasn't achieved in 2015-16. We don't know what the outturn for 16-17 will be yet, but the progress of actually starting to transform policing has been slow across the 4-year life of the SPA so far.
I mean, that, in a sense, gives rise to another concern, going now back to the point in staffing that Rona Mackay was raising earlier. Obviously, there's a commitment given for 2017-18, but nevertheless, if you're hung on the hook of delivering this balanced, sustainable budget by 2019-20, it boxes you into a corner, does it not, in terms of staffing to deliver that? I mean, given the cost I think you highlighted earlier, is there not a risk that some decisions will be taken around staffing that could be more severe and wide-ranging than they would be if a more tapered sort of trajectory to that balanced, sustainable budget had been identified? Is that a risk?
In the absence of a fully worked through financial strategy, I think it's always going to be a risk, unless you know how your pattern of income from the Scottish Government and expenditure is likely to change over the next few years, and what measures you're going to take to bring them into balance. Then it's difficult to be sure you're not making decisions now to balance this year's budget that make it harder to get to a sustainable balance for the longer term.
I was going to say, I mean, the risk is presumably that you hit your target then, but you leave the organisation less sustainable, a bit more subject to having deficient resources in areas where it needs to resource up, given, as you say, the changing nature of the service that needs to be provided. So as auditors, would you have concern that in order to hit that, in a sense, artificially set deadline, that decisions will be taken by Police Scotland and the SPA that are needlessly severe in terms of staffing levels?
I'm concerned that there isn't a fully worked through financial strategy yet, because I think that's the safeguard that helps you mitigate the risk of the wrong decisions being taken for short-term reasons that make it harder in the long term.
Okay.
Can I just come back to a point that was made around the reform budget? Because the reform budget is to provide for a single transformation portfolio. Now, if I'm correct, Mr Roberts, when you answered my colleague Liam's question, you said that it wasn't clear if the reform budget, where it was being used or how it was being used. How confident are you that the reform budget will only be used for reform, will provide for this transformation portfolio, and will be clear, transparent, and will be able to be monitored and won't be able to be pulled down into another budget?
I think what we've seen across the 3 years where we've reported so far on the SPA's budget, we've seen sort of greater progress towards transparency in how that reform money has been used. It only really, I think, became clear to us during the course of the 15-16 audit that there was clear evidence that it had gone into, in inverted commas, normal revenue budget and to support that, so therefore wasn't being used for the sort of transformational change you've described. And
are the right checks and balances in place now to ensure that that will not happen again?
I think there's significantly more assurance systems in place. I think it's the fact that the Public Audit and Post-Legislative Scrutiny Committee have asked these questions, that you are asking these questions, will put greater emphasis on the importance of transparency about how that's being used.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, Stuart?
Just to be very specific, you say in Audit Risk 6 that there was an element of 20 million simply described as reform without any breakdown and explanation. Although when I read across the results, you're saying the first draft of accounts contained limited information and this has now been amended. Are you satisfied that at least the recording of what the reform money has been spent on is now in proper order, even if there may remain doubts about whether it has been allocated to the right expenditure?
Thank you. So picking up from that risk which you've identified from our audit report, we've also followed that through in our action plan to make a recommendation with regard to that. And in the recommendations, we say, as has been discussed here, a significant number of reform costs, when made more transparent, it became evident that they formed part of the recurring revenue baseline expenditure, and management responded that they accepted this, and they also accepted the recommendation that it was now timely to carry out a review to determine the amount of reform that had been achieved by the monies invested in that fashion to date. So they do acknowledge the weaknesses there in the monitoring of those very special additional reform monies. So they've accepted that, and we certainly as external auditors will be following through to see the improvement in the recording of that information going forward.
Okay. Okay. John, you're next. Okay, I'll come to Ben then.
No, I'm very happy to ask a question.
No, because you're next on my list. But
all right. Thank you. I was, Kavina, I was going to ask go back to the review of governance that was briefly touched on, please, there. And the fact that the SPA at its meeting adopted 12 of the 30 recommendations. And it's the phrase you use, can you explain when you say the process must not continue indefinitely? Is that the process of not? This is in your smaller summary, paragraph 24. Have you concerns specifically, therefore, about the 18 recommendations that have not been picked up?
The reference there is to ensuring that all of the recommendations that have been accepted are in place and are operating. The chair of the SPA, I think, has set out his intention of reviewing the new governance arrangements after they've been in place for a period. Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabulary are committed to reviewing externally and will contribute to that. But I think what we're concerned to see is that they are all implemented so that it's then possible to review how well they're working in practice.
But of course, it was the new chair that did the review of governance.
Indeed, yes.
So,
and he did it, and it was agreed on the basis that it would be implemented and then reviewed after a period of operation to see if it needed fine-tuning or if anything needed to change. My comment here is that it's important all of the recommendations are implemented so that review is looking at the full picture.
So are you able to say, in general terms, what's not been which of the recommendations have not been implemented, and what the perhaps implications of those are, please?
Well, can you pick that one up?
I think what some of the Chair's review contained recommendations for the Scottish Government, the Scottish Police Authority and Police Scotland, and as the process of implementing the review has gone on, some of those have been combined, some of those on reflection have been sort of tweaked to reflect kind of further reflection and things. And as the Auditor General says, that there is a commitment to review kind of governance arrangements in the round later on this year. I couldn't say specifically, I'm afraid, off the top of my head, what were the details of the ones which haven't in December 2016 been implemented. We are kind of connected with the HM Inspector of Constabulary's review of an inspection of the SPA and the governance elements to that, and we'll be very happy to support him in that work.
And is there any linkage between that and your comment about greater transparency in what Police Scotland is funded and expected to deliver? Is there any relationship between the...
The reference to transparency there was a reflection of the fact that when the budget for 15-16 was set, the publicly available information that was provided to the Scottish Police Authority consisted of one line, which was supposed to cover kind of the transfer of £972 million to Police Scotland. Our experience of other public bodies would suggest that in most other cases, there's significantly more detail about what that money and that budget is going to deliver. We think that's an important element of transparency.
Does that in any way take us back to the earlier bun fights from the early days about who? I know it's not about who's doing what, but about what it is they're doing, perhaps?
I don't think I could really speculate on kind of whether it was a reflection of that history or not. I think our observation would be that relative to what we see elsewhere in the public sector, that's not a good example of transparent reporting and transparent decision making.
Are you able to comment at all on, I'll use the term personnel or human resource matters, but I really want to ask you about relationships and openness and transparency about relationships within the authority?
If you ask the question, I'll answer it as far as I'm able, and I'll tell you what I can't answer.
Do you have any concerns about the openness and transparency of the Scottish Police Authority and the relationships that the members have with some of the management? I wouldn't have anything to say at this point about relationships, I think, between members of the board and management. It's clear from matters that are in the public domain at the moment and have been over the last few weeks that there are some tensions among board members about issues of openness and transparency about how the board conducts its business and the way in which those differences have been resolved or not. Now, that's clearly not a good position for the board to be in, given the importance of the public services that it oversees and the scale of the budget that it manages. And there are clearly different views being expressed by two particular individuals there. The Public Audit Committee, I think, will be investigating what's behind that further, and I'm sure it will be an important part of Her Majesty's Chief Inspector of Constabulary's review of governance, but they are an indication of tensions that don't indicate good governance happening at the moment in that area. And I appreciate there's a time frame within which the report refers to. Those concerns weren't evident during that time frame, is that?
Jill, do you want to comment?
The recent developments are very, very new and were not evident at the time of carrying out the 2015-16 audit. I would say in relation to the example given on terms of transparency and it related to the budget documents at the time of the board meeting in March 2016, the absence of detailed, robust information to enable members to make a very informed conclusion on the budget was more indicative of the lack of financial leadership in both of the parties at that time.
So finally, if I may, that specific concern you believe will be picked up by the appointment of people taking leadership in the areas of finance?
Yes, and indeed it's due to the structural change with the new Chief Operating Officer in Police Scotland, under whom there will be the new Chief Finance Officer that has previously been referred to, and that individual, whilst sitting in Police Scotland, will also have a line of accountability to the Chief Executive of the Scottish Police Authority, who's the accountable officer for the full sum of money that's spent on those two bodies. So that is a structural change that we welcome, and we can see the potential for that being successful.
Okay, thank you all.
Margaret.
Yes, it was on that line. I think it's, absolutely staggering that it was a one-line budget for a 970 million amount of funding. So as well as just who's responsible, just what has been put into place to itemise what's been spent, why it was spent, and what the outcome of that spending was, because that seems to me absolutely fundamental, and it's a bit unclear if even at this stage that's going to be delivered.
Hand over to Jill in a moment. Our concern expressed in this report was about the lack of transparency. There clearly was more information behind the 972 million available to Police Scotland and to management to understand what was in there. And as Jill said earlier, it has been monitored. But for any public body to be approving a one-line budget would be unusual and, in my view, unacceptable. For it to be nearly £1 billion is remarkable. Jill.
And yes, that is the case. There were other supplementary papers with far greater detail and breakdown for that particular figure, and it will have been discussed in some detail at the Finance and Investment Committee. But our point was to do with the paper that came forward at the public meeting of the board to approve the budget, and that's what lacked the detail.
Has Audit Scotland got an example of perhaps another public body that has good practice where the money is spent, there's a clear, if you like, link from where it's spent to what was purchased to what was achieved, that they could perhaps cite that would be useful?
I think our experience is that most public bodies provide much more detail than that about the way the money will be spent, on what it will be spent, staff and other lines of the budget, and also what it's looking to achieve. And as you'll know, this Parliament is itself looking at what information it wants in the Scottish Government's draft budget in future. So I think we're not looking for anything that's unusual or very challenging, but it is critical for a budget this size and a public service that's this important to people.
Liam.
You've talked earlier about what you see as a kind of improved relationship and probably a clarity of roles between Police Scotland and SPA. But as you were saying in response to John's earlier questions around the recent controversy amongst members in the SPA, I mean, is it your view that because of some of the adverse publicity surrounding the SPA and the Police Scotland in the past, there is still a bit of a tendency to be wary of transparency for fear of what exposure to the kind of public glare may bring in terms of either scrutiny or indeed media attention or public attention? Is that a legitimate concern for us to hold?
My sense is that that's probably still an element of that, and I don't think it would be terribly surprising. I think given the history of the last 4 years, it will take a while for people to come to a settled way of working and a settled shared understanding of what level of openness and transparency is required. I think in particular, though, the information that's been aired in the last few weeks has made it clear that the board itself doesn't yet have that shared view of what's an appropriate level of transparency and openness and how it balances that with the need for space to do its business and to have private discussions before reaching significant decisions about future directions.
Is that something that you or colleagues would be able to advise them on in terms of how to strike that balance? I mean, clearly, as you say, there'll be occasions where full and frank discussions need to take place, but those can only really happen with a degree of buy-in from the public if they feel that to the extent possible information is being made available ahead of time as appropriate.
In general terms, yes, and we always aim to be helpful to the bodies that we audit. In terms of specific advice, that's something we try to avoid getting too involved in because we do need to step back and reach our own conclusion about the quality and effectiveness of governance arrangements. I mentioned earlier that we'll be contributing to Her Majesty's Chief Inspector's review of governance, which he's announced will happen this year. Mark's actually meeting the Chief Inspector and his team later to talk about what they'll be looking at and how we contribute. And I think that's probably a more effective way of us helping to develop a shared view of what's appropriate, both to carry out the scrutiny and governance that's very important and to build public confidence in policing.
Okay, thank you.
Ben.
Thank you, Convener. Good afternoon. Much of the area that I wanted to cover has already been touched on by Rona and Liam, but perhaps there's some more information that can be provided. Obviously, it's been outlined by yourself, Auditor General, that there's a weak financial leadership issue here, that there's a need to think strategically about deficit reduction moving forward. In terms of taking action and looking to the future, you've highlighted the importance of a long-term financial strategy that is underpinned by a wider strategy for policing, and identified the Policing 2026 as having the potential for transformational, or certainly it's envisaged within that document for transformational change around technology and efficiency and corporate services and productivity. I just wondered, given the challenges that are being faced, do you think that the Policing 2026 consultation provides the necessary foundations for an effective financial strategy, or is further initiative required in order to meet these challenges?
I think the strategy that's been published for consultation provides a very clear vision of policing in 10 years' time and of how it will be different from what Police Scotland inherited. What I don't think exists yet, though, is the series of plans for how we get from where we are here to what that vision sets out. Because I'm an auditor, I think a financial strategy is a really important part of that, but that financial strategy will draw together things like a workforce plan, an estates plan, an ICT plan, a fleet plan, a whole range of things that set out how each of the elements of policing will need to change over that period, how it will be afforded, what needs to happen in what sequence to make it work effectively. And it's that level which needs to be put in place next, and I think very quickly, if the funding gap is to be managed over the period that's there.
And in terms of the, a lot of that is operational strategising, and the appointment of the chief financial officer will obviously be a key element of that. Will there be an ongoing dialogue and collaboration between your office and Police Scotland on taking this forward, or is that will it be just when you audit next that we'll be able to see progress on that?
The starting point for all of my reports to Parliament is the annual audit work that goes on in every public body and in the SPA and Police Scotland. We're obviously just coming to the end of the current financial year now. Jill's successor as the auditor of the SPA is currently carrying out the planning that you see reflected in last year's audit report, and the audit work will be concluded over the next 6 months or so. So it is a continuing engagement with them, but we are looking for evidence about what they're doing to respond to the recommendations that I've made in my reports to Parliament and that Jill's made in her reports as their auditor over the last 4 years.
Thank you. Thank you, Convener.
Just before I bring in Margaret again, can I just follow up the question that Ben asked? Because in relation to the long-term financial strategy, and there is an acknowledgement that the long-term financial strategy, there is a link between that and the Policing 2026 consultation document. Since November 2013, Audit Scotland have been recommending the development of the long-term financial strategy. And we've touched on a lot of the elements that will make up part of that long-term financial strategy. And I suppose I'm looking for assurances from yourselves that there is enough of a sense of urgency and a full understanding of the need to have a proper long-term financial strategy. Because by the time the consultation exercise on the Policing 2026 is completed, that could perhaps be another year, another 18 months, and then there's a number of other elements that need to be tied into this. Do you have any idea when we might get sight of this long-term financial strategy?
One of my professional frustrations is that, as you say, I've been recommending it for nearly 4 years now, and some progress has been made, but we're still some way from having a detailed strategy in place. The new Chief Constable, Chair of the Board and Chief Executive have given assurances to the Public Audit Committee that they do recognise the need for it and that work is underway. I think the only assurance I can give you, Convener, is that we will continue to monitor progress and to report it to this Parliament through the statutory powers that are available to me. Mark, was there something you wanted to add to that?
No, I don't think so. I mean, as the Auditor General said, we've been recommending this since November 2013, as you said, Convener. Work has been going on, and we've seen that work and what's going on. That's now been rolled into the wider Policing 2026 development. So clearly not starting from scratch on doing that, but the kind of the vision that 2026 outlines alters some of the parameters in which they're thinking about the finances, and of course new information is always coming on. So the work is in progress, but I couldn't say for sure exactly how long that would take.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah,
Margaret.
I suppose it's following on from both Ben and the Convener's question. The Chief Constable is very clear that he must have a corporate approach, and there are certain systems that need to be in place, need to be dealt with. And I think you maybe answered what these systems were with Ben. But is it not the case if they don't have the long-term financial strategy in place right at the very top, they're never, ever going to reach the corporate approach which is necessary to deliver what the Chief Constable says must be done. He needs done to make it an effective police force.
I think we'd see it as being an iterative approach, that there is an acknowledgement that the 188 million funding gap we've identified is a reasonable estimate. The Policing 2026 strategy that's for consultation sets out what policing might look like in 10 years' time. There's then a job of matching what that would cost with the funding that's available in each year in between, looking at where there might be a shortfall or indeed room to invest, looking at what investment plans would be needed to change the shape of the workforce overall, or to invest in different IT or in different estates to make it possible. And that will feed back into the financial strategy. So I don't think one comes before the other. I think they need to be developed in parallel and to take account each of the other of the picture that evolves as you dig down into the detail around that.
So if they haven't got one element of it even ongoing just now, then clearly the other element is going to fall. If the financial, long-term financial starting isn't in place alongside, not even up there and decided before, then the corporate approach isn't going to work.
I guess the way I'd try and describe it is that if you have a vision of what the workforce might look like as we're starting to develop through the 2026 strategy, the next step is to look at how affordable that is with the likely level of revenue from the Scottish Government and the costs of employing police officers and staff, to look at what the shape of the workforce would look like over time, to how you might be able to change those to where you can find money to invest, to make savings. All of those questions need to follow having the broad picture. So it's the next stage of the work that's required.
Can I ask one last question? Communication. How's this all being communicated for any holistic approach or corporate identity that you want to try or function that you want to achieve? Good lines of communication are absolutely fundamental. Are you confident that that's in place?
I think the public communication of the draft strategy has started well over the last couple of weeks. I know for this committee and this subcommittee and its predecessor, communication with the various staff and police staff bodies has been an area of concern. I think you would need to ask them how it looks from their point of view. I'm not sure we're in a position to give you any assurance over that.
Okay, thank you.
Stuart.
Just a wee technical point. Since we're operating under IFRS, have the authority got any contingent assets? And if so, how are they dealing with that? Are they part of the fixed asset system, or are they dealt with otherwise, or just don't we know? Or are there none, as there may be?
Any items of significance would be in the annual audit report, which you've had the opportunity to have sight of. And from recollection, there are no significant contingent assets associated with this audit. We spend a significant amount of time, as you can imagine, with contingent liabilities and all sorts of liabilities, but contingent assets are not a significant element of this particular audit.
So there's no PFI contracts going to crystallise in the near horizon that would transfer assets from a PFI contractor to Police Scotland?
So if there were to be any significant PFI elements, they would be sitting within liabilities and crystallised in the balance sheet. But there are not significant PFI assets associated with this particular audit, unlike any other public sector audit.
That's fine. I may return to the subject.
Okay. The papers for the SPA board meeting on the 24th of February included a report on actions to address the key findings of your 2015-16 report. Does it contain anything that we've not covered today that you would like to comment on?
I don't think so. I think, as Jill said, we are pleased that they have accepted both the recommendations in the action plan in Jill's report and with the Public Audit Committee the conclusions in my Section 22 report. Our interest is in implementation of those actions now, and we'll be following that up through the 16-17 audit.
Okay, thank you. Do you have any concerns about the SPA's board's decision to meet in private?
I'll preface my remarks by saying that we haven't yet reviewed the governance arrangements which are now in place, and we will do that along with HMI Constabulary. We've obviously been keeping a close eye on both the governance review and the events that have happened in the last few weeks around it. The on-board guidance for public bodies is clear about the expectations around openness and transparency. They don't go as far as requiring boards to meet in public, but for boards that are providing public services, I think that's increasingly common and is seen as being good practice. Equally, I do think it's important that each board strikes the right balance between what happens in public and is genuinely accountable in that way to the public and builds confidence, and having space to have full and frank discussions about difficult issues where there will be preliminary views that need to be worked through. So I don't want to prejudge the outcome, but I think it is quite a nuanced question.
As there are no further questions from the committee to the panel of witnesses, can I thank you all for attending and for the evidence that you have given us today. The next subcommittee meeting will be on Thursday the 30th of March, when we will again hear from the Auditor General for Scotland, this time on Audit Scotland's recent review of the I6 programme. And I now close the 5th meeting of the Justice Subcommittee on Policing. Thank you.